anything we talked about today yet? Excuse me, I do, I'll wait till everybody's in, and then I have a correction from the syllabus, that was pointed out to me, which I appreciate. So, last week, we started talking, and we talked about how cities get to regulate, how they get, how they have the power, the fact that it has to be delegated to them in order to adopt regulations, and that one of the regulations they can adopt is zoning. And the power to zone derives, and I say this again, I may have said it last week, but the power to zone is delegated by the state. But the state ability to sort of regulate zone, the state sort of inherent, the fact that the state does this, is through what's called the police power. Right? Cities have, right? And what is the police power? The police power is the power to adopt regulations for the public health, safety, and general welfare. Sometimes morals goes in there, but it's public health, safety, and general welfare. And zoning is an aspect, is an element of the police power. Because that's what the purpose of zoning is, right? It's to regulate under the police power for the protection of public health, safety, and general welfare. If a regulation is not advancing public health, safety, and general welfare, it is not a valid zoning regulation. It is not a valid any kind of government police power regulation.
States use that?
States sort of don't exist. It's not, I mean, states are not really limited by that. I mean, taxing power has nothing to do with the public health, safety, and general welfare, really. That's a different power, taxing power. But most of the regulatory power that a government exercises, cities and state, is public health, safety, and general welfare. And the fact that something isn't, it doesn't further the public health, safety, and general welfare is one of the limiting the ways that you have to overturn a law, a regulatory law. Right? Taxing power is very different. But the regulatory power. It's furthering the police power. So, by the early, so kind of start with this. So we're talking about zoning, we're gonna spend a couple weeks talking about it. So what is? It is the division of land into districts for the purpose of regulating the use and development of land within such districts, principally to regulate the use. Determine size, density, use, and all kinds of other things. So, before we go to the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, let's see if we can get there. Hopefully we can. So, I started talking last week about predecessors to zoning and sort of precursors. But in fact, by the mid 1915, many cities had adopted some type of law controlling one or more aspects of land use and development in the cities. Originally principally related to use, to separate different uses in one part of the city, to separate different uses in another part of the city. Let's see if we can get here. Oh, we're loading very slowly. New York City, and we talked last week about the fact, why do we have this? Technology was allowing for bigger buildings. But the real issue was originally, was a couple things. One, was separation of uses. That was the biggest concern. How do we separate uses? We don't want, as we were industrializing and people were moving into cities and cities were growing, there was significantly more development in cities and people like Mrs. Bove was beginning to be affected by industry in her city. And New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning ordinance in 1916. Not the first zoning ordinance. Many other cities had some kind of zoning regulation. It was the first comprehensive, meaning that it dealt with the entire city. And the New York City zoning ordinance divided the city into 3 types of districts. Bless you. There was a residential district, I think there was a commercial district, and there was an unrestricted, where you could do anything. So the city, New York, I mean, that was it. It was pretty standard. Then it had separate bulk area districts dealing with land use, with bulk and size of buildings. But besides use, and even as part of use, one of the reasons for it had to do with fire safety. If you have industries next to residential development, industry may be more susceptible to fire. Yes, a wooden single-family home is going to be more likely to catch on fire than a stone building, but industries often in the production may cause fire. And so there was a concern with separating residential uses from industry, not just because of, smell and smoke and pollutants and things like that, but from the simple aspect of fire protection. How do you protect the residential uses from likelihood of fire? And likelihood of fire was another main reason for, I'd say it was the secondary reason for why we started having land use regulation, as well as some of the light and air caused by development. Now, because cities were beginning to deal with this, in 1924, the Department of Commerce promulgated a model State Zoning Enabling Act, or what was called a Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. What role does the federal government have in zoning? None. This was just a model act. Anyone can write a model act. There is a Christian organization that produces model laws to keep out adult uses. And I'd probably say hundreds of cities have adopted that model law. It's not a Christian law per se, it is a Christian, not-for-profit that is concerned about adult uses, and so drafted a model law that cities could adopt to ensure that they don't have adult uses in the community. This was a law that the Department of Commerce was saying, hey, every state, here is a piece of legislation that you state could adopt. Why? To enable cities. This was enabling legislation. This is the law that the state would adopt in order for cities to have the power to adopt zoning regulations. So that's what this was. This was a Standard State Enabling Act. If a state adopted this, it gave cities the power to adopt zoning. Every single state adopted this, more or less exactly as it was written. It came out in 1924, then in 1926 there was another, then in 1928, and it kept getting a little updated. But more or less this was adopted by every single state. So by the 1930s, the same law was on the books in every state. All right, so let's look at the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, because in large part the Standard Zoning Enabling Act is the basis of all zoning ordinances in the United States, because every state had this enabling legislation on its books. So what cities did is, okay, so let's go. So here we go, we start right here. This is the start. This is there's an introduction. most of this page is footnotes explaining what it means. But let's go to the law itself. All right, so section 1, grant of power. Why are states delegating this? To promote the public health, safety, morals, I said some places it's morals, or the general welfare of the community. That's the police power. For the purposes of the, we have, right, the legislative body, okay, legislative body are the people who adopt laws. A city council in a city, might be what's in some places it's called a board of trustees, in some places it's called just the town board, it might be called the board of commissioners, it can have different names in different places. They're the people who can adopt laws in a city. And incorporated villages, so municipalities, is hereby empowered to regulate and restrict the height, number of stories, size of buildings and other structures, lot coverage, size of yards and other spaces, and the location of use and buildings and structures and land for trade, industry. So what is the purpose? What is it that the Enabling Act is doing? It's giving cities the power to regulate and restrict all of these things for the public health, safety, and general welfare. That, in a nutshell, is what zoning is, and what cities have the power to do. That first section is really a very broad statement of the power. Now, how does it do this? It divides the municipality into districts of such number, shape, and area as may be deemed best suited to carry out the purpose of this act. Unlike with respect to political bases, the regulation, it could be any size, shape, whatever the city decides it wants. And within such districts, it can put all the regulations at once. All such regulations shall be uniform for each class or kind of buildings throughout such district. The concept being is that right of zoning, you divide your city into zoning districts. You set up separate rules for each district. Within every district, the rules are the same. So everybody's in a district called R1 has the same rules. Everybody in a district called R2 has the same rules. Whatever they are, they're all the same. Okay, now, the next sentence, which is a very important one, in section 3, purposes in view. Such regulations shall be made in accordance with a comprehensive plan. Does New York City have a comprehensive plan?
Yes.
Yes.
Why do you say yes?
Because there's a big crazy zoning.
It has a really crazy, yes, and that actually is a very, I'll get back to that comment in a second about yes. No, I'm serious, it's very important. But who said no? No, New York City does not have a comprehensive plan. If we think about what a comprehensive plan is, right? And we will talk about planning whenever we get to it.
What do you mean when you say they don't have?
New York City doesn't have, New York City never sat down and said, I think that this is the area, what is comprehensive planning? Comprehensive planning is sort of looking at your city and saying, how do I want my city to develop? I want to have residential use in this portion of the city, because residential use is good here, because it's not immediately on a highway, and we've got lots of streets, and we have good subway access, maybe as New York City, and maybe because we have, this land has never been developed for industrial use, so we don't have to worry about too many contaminants, and we're gonna turn this corner of the city into our residential corner. And we're gonna turn that corner of our city into industrial, because it's on the railroad, or in the early 1900s, right? The industrial areas were on the water, because all of the industrial traffic was by boat. So There is no doubt, and if we're gonna have residential use up here, what else do we need? Well, we need schools up there, and we need libraries, and we need whatever else, and if we're going to have industrial use down here, what do we need? We need roads that are sufficient to bring trucks, and we need docks for, big docks maybe, and maybe we need a railroad that runs through here. That's planning. New York City's never done that. That would be a comprehensive plan, to be looking at an entire city and saying, what do we want our city to look like? What do we want to develop? What do we want here? And it's never done that. Okay? But wait, didn't that say such regulations shall be made in accordance with a comprehensive plan? So, what? And Julius's answer was the right answer. The zoning ordinance. In some year, the courts determined that, in New York State actually, New York, the Court of Appeals, determined that a zoning ordinance, a comprehensive zoning ordinance, is in and of itself a comprehensive plan because you have comprehensively zoned for the city. Problem is, zoning only deals with certain things, so when we talk about planning, we'll talk about why this really isn't a comprehensive plan. But from a zoning perspective, it is comprehensive and therefore. So, courts, different states by law and by court have sort of three different views of this idea of that it has to have a comprehensive plan, yeah.
Would it be possible that, as New York was already developed and is already very congested, that's what you said? Yeah. It does not need a comprehensive plan because it's more like for like cities in development?
Well, so let's leave out 1916. But when 1916 New York City wasn't developed, there were half of Queens, half of Brooklyn, half of Staten Island, Upper Manhattan, had lots of raw land. All right, now 1916 was before this came out, so it could have had didn't have a comprehensive plan. The Bronx, Manhattan, central Manhattan and downtown Manhattan were pretty developed. But Upper Manhattan, lots of Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx were not in the least bit developed.
It's not because the mayor is supposed try to delegate it down to the city council. Like, for example, Sunset Park had its own development plan, and I had to work with them closely and development out there. And the same thing with Long Island City right now, with going on Amazon. So, it's kind of been parceled out, delegated downward, politically, because the mayor doesn't want
But-
the money.
But way more now than it was 30 years ago, and that's politics, which is interesting, and when we talk about New York City, we'll talk some more about that. But New York City doesn't have a comprehensive plan. So, as I said, there are three approaches to what that means. One approach is what's called the unified concept, which is if a zoning ordinance is comprehensive, then that satisfies the requirement for a comprehensive plan. It's a court this is a court created. Another is some states by law require that you create a comprehensive plan. State law requires that there be in some states. California, Florida, Maryland. There's a lot more, but those are the ones that just come to mind. Oregon, Washington, all have comprehensive plans. Every city has to have a comprehensive plan.
Is that because these states have a lot of open space still?
Well, we'll talk about why those states, and it's usually not got to do with a lot of and Maryland doesn't have a lot of open space. It usually has nothing to do with open space, it usually has to do with something else, like water. And control of resources. But New York has that, and yet New York State has no requirement for comprehensive. So some states do and some states don't. And then and that goes to kind of, the question then is, if you have to create a comprehensive plan, what does that mean? Right? So now I have a comprehensive plan. Okay, it's very nice. I put it up on the wall. There's my comprehensive plan. Now I go about my business. When we talk more about planning, the concept that some states, state law not only requires the adoption of a comprehensive plan, but requires that the zoning be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And then in some states, there's no requirement of a comprehensive plan, that the comprehensive plan be adopted beforehand, but that allow for the adoption of a comprehensive plan and set rules. So, there does have to be a comprehensive plan, but whether it's a separate comprehensive plan or not depends on really state law. Okay. And so why are we having it? To lessen congestion, to secure safety from fire, panic, health and general welfare. A lot of this is sort of repetitious, overcrowding. Notice this, to facilitate the adequate provision of transportation, water, sewage, schools, park, and other public requirements. That's planning. It's not part of zoning. Zoning doesn't tell you whether you're gonna have a subway system here, whether you're gonna have enough water or enough sewer. That's part of planning. But it isn't done, except in states that require comprehensive plans.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were going into, different types of concepts, and you talked about the unified concepts. Was there any more follow-up
Oh,
concepts?
the other one is, so that's the unified, the other one is you have to have a separate plan, right? Like the states that do, it's a completely separate plan. And some states, it depends on, you don't have to have a separate plan, you could have a separate plan.
Okay.
What does separate plan mean?
Florida law requires that that every city has to adopt a comprehensive plan. What do I mean by a comprehensive plan? Comprehensive plan, here is
No, my question was, when you said separate plan.
a separate New York City, the courts in New York State said, a city doesn't need a separate comprehensive plan. The zoning ordinance is a comprehensive plan in and of itself because it's comprehensively zoned. A separate plan is, no, I'm gonna adopt a comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan that says that the waterfront in New York should be developed for industrial uses, and we should do this at the waterfront. Midtown Manhattan should be developed for commercial uses, and we should do this in Midtown,
Okay.
and so forth.
It's like an urban plan, comprehensive, it's like any urban planning. Just like
Yes, that's what comprehensive plan is, urban planning, exactly. But comprehensively for an entire city.
Yes.
Exactly, it's exactly what I mean.
Wait, what's the difference between that and zoning then? You're basically saying they're the same thing,
They are
right?
not the same thing. We will talk more about planning later, but I'll do it quickly. Zoning deals with land use and land development. In the early 2000s, no, that wasn't it, in the 80s and 90s, New York City developed Battery Park City, okay? It zoned it for residential use. When it decided to develop Battery Park City, did it provide schools? No. Did it ensure that there were supermarkets? No. Did it ensure that there was a subway system that went there? No. There was no planning. There was zoning, not the same thing. Right, we have Hudson Yards. They did build a subway system, so, but that's the difference between zoning. At its simplest level, that's the difference between zoning and planning. Okay, so, now, how does it do that? So the regulations have to consider the character of the district. Again, that's much more like planning. To conserve the values of buildings and the most appropriate use of land throughout such municipality. Okay, how does it do that? So the legislative body of each municipality provides for the manner in which the regulations shall be determined. So this law is delegated, if adopted by a state, this law would delegate to the cities the power to adopt zoning. The legislative body adopts it. But they can't adopt it unless there's a public hearing with 15 days notice. That's how it adopts a zoning law. Now, can it be changed? Such regulations, restrictions, and boundaries, right? The language of the words of the text and the boundaries may be amended from time to time. Now we get to something that's actually exists everywhere, including in New York City. In case of a protest, so normally legislation is adopted by a majority, right? So the city council is 51 seats, 26, 50 city council districts. There's 51, but there's 50 or 51. You have a majority, 26 votes, and something passes. However, in case of a protest against such change, not the initial zoning, so a city adopts an initial zoning ordinance and then it wants to change it. What happens? In case of a protest signed by 20% or more of the owners of either the lots included in the change or those immediately adjacent, right, extending X feet, because that's up to the city, the state to decide what that number should be. Such amendment shall not become effective except by the favorable vote of 3/4 of all members. It's called a supermajority rule. And that rule exists, that's in the New York State law. So if you had, and I can't remember exactly what the percentage is in New York City or what the distance is, but if you have enough people protest a change in the zoning regulation, then you need a supermajority to vote. They have to submit a petition and there's a process. It exists. I think every state enabling legislation has this, which means it exists in every city. The rule for a supermajority vote.
What's the 20%?
That's what so this is what this, I don't remember what it is in New York City. I don't think it's 20%, I think it might be 15%, and what I don't remember is the distance and exactly what the specifics are. But there is the concept that there is some percentage of property owners surrounding the rezoning, the change, who, if they object and file a petition at a certain time in accordance with certain rules, can make it be approved, not by a majority, by a supermajority. That concept exists probably everywhere. Okay, then this called for the creation of something called the zoning commission, which was the initial zoning commission. When New York City redid its zoning ordinance in 1961, the 50s, it created a zoning commission that considered all kinds of things. It was a zoning commission. It was so to be adopted. Okay. Now, we have now, if you think about it, how many pages has this been? One, and not much, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a little over 5 pages, pieces of pages. Now we get to something called the Board of Adjustment, section 7. Such local legislative body may provide for the appointment of a Board of Adjustment. And may provide that the Board of Adjustment make special exceptions to the terms of the ordinance in harmony with its general rules and in accordance. Okay. Now, special exceptions is another, in the concept of special exceptions as written here is variances. Not special permits, which they're also called special exceptions. The terminology that's used sometimes gets a little whatever. And the Board of Adjustment is more commonly called in most places the Board of Appeals. So, as I said, there were 5 pages devoted to zoning. There are 4 pages devoted to the Board of Adjustment or the Board of Appeals, right? In New York City, it's still called the Board of Standards and Appeals. Is there other powers? All right, so this is all about how it does it. Right, appeals to the Board of Adjustment may be taken by any person aggrieved by any decision of an administrative officer. And there's a time period within which it must be taken, and what's the power that it has? To hear and decide appeals where it is alleged that there is error in enforcement. Right, the building inspector should have given me a building permit but didn't. Special exceptions. Variance. So it created the concept of special exception, which in some places is the same thing as variances, but didn't really talk about what a special exception was. And I said it wasn't special permit, but in some places, special exceptions are the same term that's used for special permit. So it did create this amorphous concept of special exceptions, without saying what or where they are. Variance. Well, where can you get a variance? Where the ordinance will result in unnecessary hardship, and so that the spirit of the ordinance shall be observed and substantial justice done. So there's a lot of process. The ability to have a board of adjustment to vary the rules of the zoning resolution were critical, because there was an enormous concern that without it, you could have unconstitutional conditions. I mean, the simplest level, let's take the simplest example. You have a piece of property that is get red. You have a piece of property, and that's your property. Right? Let's say it's 100 feet here, and let's say it's 50, well, let's say it's 100 feet deep. And let's say the zoning ordinance requires that you have a 30-foot front yard. Now, we're gonna talk all about all of the rest of this book, right? And it has a 30-foot side yard and another 30-foot side yard here. So now you've got down to 60 feet width. And it's got a 50-foot rear yard. I've got 20 feet. That's probably not actually might be big enough. Let's make it smaller. 75 feet. Sorry, I'm just trying to get, that's 40 feet. I've got a 40-foot rear yard requirement. I've got a 30-foot front yard. That gives me the ability to build a house that's 10 feet deep, but because of my triangular shape, there's no possible way I could develop a house on this property. Can't be done. So I have a problem here that the government is not letting me build on my property. There was a concern. We'll talk about that later in the semester when we talk about takings, but right now, there was a huge concern that if this is what the effect of the law was, of a zoning ordinance, there was some concern that the law would be declared unconstitutional. And so this was a way of protecting the constitutionality of the law. And so there was a lot of focus on it. And that's it. That is, then it's, okay, enforcement, the local legislative body may provide for enforcement, and how it is. In case a building is erected in violation of this law, the proper local authorities may institute any appropriate action or proceedings to prevent such unlawful, so they could stop it from being built. And then there's conflict. This is the state, every state adopted, as I said, this law. And from this law, we got the vast majority of zoning ordinances in the US. Not New York City, because New York City came before, but most states, most cities. This gave the cities the power to do it, and this set the sort of parameters of that law. So you haven't looked at it yet, you should look at it, because it really sort of sets, as I say, the parameters for what a zoning ordinance is going to have. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the concerned nuisance concept, land use. There was a recognition that there was a thought that land use was a local issue. And one problem we have today, of course, is that land use is still seen as a local issue. But land use is really not a local issue. And going with land use as a local issue, something I didn't talk about last week, where can a city adopt laws? Can New York City decide it wants to adopt laws for Scarsdale? No, a city can adopt laws only within its own boundaries, except some cities in some states have what's called extra-jurisdictional zoning power. And they have that generally in cities, in states where there's a recognition that cities are going to grow. And so you want the city to be able to control what's going on around its immediate boundaries, so that when it expands by annexation, it is going to have, it's not gonna have completely foreign uses or uses that are antithetical or development that is antithetical to the city's growth. In most places, so it's local. You can only, even when you have extraterritorial jurisdiction, it's still local. But land use, like most things, is not local. All right. So there was all the growth, recognizing that there's value to it. And there was really also the concept of racism that was inherent in some of the desire to control development. And the thing that's interesting about that, though, is racism as a source of zoning has happened much more since the 1960s. Because early zoning ordinances were much more like, if you think about an old neighborhood, if you go, think about, not an old neighborhood that's been modernized, but if you go to an old neighborhood, any state, right? A neighborhood that developed in the, let's say, the teens or the 20s, the last century, it was mixed use. You had your commercial uses next to your residential uses, and you might even have industries there. That's how cities developed. And it was when cities started segregating uses that we started to have much more of this sort of institutionalized racism. From a land use perspective, it has nothing to do with other kinds of racism and other kinds of control. But most cities originally didn't really, you could have any kind of in a residential neighborhood, most cities allowed any kind of residential use. So you could have apartment buildings and single-family homes, and they all could be in one neighborhood. In the 60s is really when cities started to foster really and focus on the growth of single-family neighborhoods. What did I just read? Something like in 1960, Los Angeles had the ability, the zoning allowed for the development of something like 10 million people. By the 1990s, they only allowed for 4 million. Why? Because they adopted single-family zoning, which hadn't existed up until then. So the 60s is really when we saw the growth of this kind of segregation, zoning segregation, and single-family home, and the problem with lack of housing. Okay. So this is kind of a summary, it's another list of it. Okay. History. So now let's start talking a little bit about zoning. Oh, before we get, where's my, I think it's in the wrong order, but okay, this is in this order, so we'll take it in this order. And we'll go back to the negative thing that this is it. Okay, I talked about what zoning was, right? It's really the division of zoning into districts. But a zoning ordinance has two parts. What are the two parts? Every zoning ordinance has two parts. Because you saw it there, or you know. Okay, map. What's the other? Text. And that's fine, you're looking at the thing. The two parts are not use and bulk. The two parts of a zoning ordinance are text and map. And you can't have a zoning ordinance you can't have one without the other. What happens if you have a zoning ordinance with no map, and the zoning ordinance creates something called residential districts? What you don't know is where those residential districts are. Is my property residential? Is your property residential? You need the map. Similarly, if you have a map with no text, then you know that this property is zoned C6, what is it? This building I think is on C6, or C64, C65. Let's say C64. Okay, so this building is zoned C64. What does that mean? Just telling you it's zoned C64 tells you nothing. Without text and map, you don't have. There's a case from the 1970s or 80s, Colorado, a small town in Colorado, and they could, so every state law, every state when it, as part of the enabling legislation might say, how the process for adoption and where the official zoning map is. They couldn't find the official zoning map, the most recently adopted zoning map. So there was a fight between the property owner and the city as to what his map was zoned, what his property was zoned. And the court said, because there is no official map, there is no zoning, his property was unzoned. So you need both, right? Text, map, okay. Anyone read Euclid v. Ambler? The most famous case in zoning history. Why is it the most famous case in zoning history? What's traditional zoning called? Does anyone know what traditional zoning is called?
Euclidean or something?
Euclidean zoning. What's the name of that case? The word Euclidean zoning has nothing to do with the philosopher mathematician Euclid. It comes from this case. Okay? So this was the case that upheld the constitutionality of zoning. Okay? So, right, Ambler Realty owned 68 acres in Euclid. And it was a suburb of Cleveland. So the village adopted a zoning ordinance with 6 uses. And we have to go to the next one. Here is the, right, this was Ambler Realty's property. U2, U3, and U6. So there was the railroad. So what do you think is the best use for this property? Given its location on a railroad that goes right to a big city. Industrial. But the city of Euclid didn't want to have industrial use so much. Okay? So it didn't allow for as much residential. So it had, this was zoned for residential use. And the back was zoned for any use. As I said, most zoning ordinances originally adopted, didn't have, really had these unrestricted uses. So there was some development, but Ambler Realty wanted to use this entire property for industrial use. And so they sued. Let's go back, okay? Arguing that the zoning ordinance had substantially reduced the value of their property because they could only use the frontage for residential, and residential wasn't the highest and best use. Industrial would have been the highest and best use. All right?
Did they not know the zoning when they bought the land?
Well, they may have bought the land before the zoning was adopted.
But did they?
They would have, because they'd owned it. Either way, that doesn't help. And when we talk about grandfathering, we'll talk about why, but it doesn't help.
That's the whole point of zoning, right?
What?
To have rules.
Yeah, it's the right to regulate land use. Okay, so, they sued. And they wanted an injunction against the city. And the court said, zoning is an exercise of the police power. If the validity of legislative classification, right, and that was what the issue was about. They weren't objecting so much to zoning per se, they were objecting to what their land had been zoned for. If all of their land had been zoned U6, they would probably have been fine. They were objecting to the particular uses that were allowed to be used on their property. If the validity of legislative classification is fairly debatable, in other words, the particular zoning districts that the city had adopted the legislative judgment controls. Right? So the court upheld the validity of zoning ordinances. Now, this case dealt with, the question of whether the zoning ordinance as a whole was valid. They said the zoning ordinance isn't valid in the sense because the way it zoned it was not valid. 2 years later, in another case, Mechtow v. City of Cambridge, the plaintiffs had a different child. In that case, the City of Cambridge divided its city into 3 use districts: residential, business, and unrestricted, which is what New York City was at 3 districts. It was a very common way of doing it: residential, business, and unrestricted. And in that case, the plaintiff's property was zoned residential, but the surrounding properties were all industrial. Therefore, they said, their property should have been zoned industrial because you couldn't put residential use here. And the court said, the power to zone is not unlimited. It must bear a substantial relation to the public health, safety, and general welfare. And the court noted that in this particular case, the zoning of this particular property for residential use was not, did not bear a substantial relation to the public health, safety, and general welfare, that this property could have been zoned industrial without upsetting kind of the whole thesis behind City of Cambridge's zoning ordinance. And so it was held, that zoning ordinance was held, it's called as applied to that particular property, it was not constitutional. So the concept so between the 2 cases, you understand that the concept of zoning was valid. That's what the Euclid case said. But that in any particular case, with respect to any particular property, it is possibly not. Now, don't take that to mean you can challenge zoning. Because in order to challenge zoning, like any piece of legislation, you basically have to be, way more certain. The city gets the benefit of the doubt. The legislative judgment gets deferred to. You have to really prove that there's no valid basis for what they did. No reason, it's not a reasonable person's standard, but there's nobody could have ever said it was reasonable. Okay.
But if they owned the land first and then they rezoned it on them, isn't there some case?
Yes, there's a concept called grandfathering.
Right.
And I don't wanna take it up now.
No,
If you are grandfathered, then you have the right to continue to develop your property for some use for which it was previously zoned. Or either to use it, or if you're vested, it's 2 concepts, grandfathering and investing, slightly different concepts. Under certain rules, you may be allowed to continue to develop or continue to use your property for a use that the zoning doesn't allow. Okay? We will take that up, and it's a much bigger discussion rather than
Sounds like there's more to this case.
To which case? Euclid?
Yeah,
There's no
it's-
more to this case. He hadn't developed anything yet.
Yeah, but they still own the land.
Doesn't matter. Ownership of the land doesn't prevent government from regulating what you do with it. And if you remember, when we talk about grandfathering investing, it's actually, if anybody remembers, we'll talk about why this wasn't grandfathered. Right? If you remember, I'm happy to explain why this wasn't. And you'll probably be able to figure it out yourself at that point, because we'll talk about why. But we'll talk about why this wasn't grandfathered, why he couldn't say, I can use my land for whatever I want. But even if he could have, even if he was grandfathered, that wouldn't have made the zoning ordinance invalid. The fact that you may be grandfathered and have the right to use your property for something that the zoning doesn't allow doesn't prevent the ordinance from being constitutional or valid. 2 different theories. Even if he had been grandfathered, the zoning ordinance would have been constitutional. Okay, this is why the other one is in the wrong place. All right, so just to show you what zoning maps of different cities look like, here's New York City. We'll talk more about this when we talk about New York City. All right, tables of contents, okay. So, talk a little bit about zoning. Zoning is one of the most, and why this is so critical, both in your future use and as you do, is zoning is one of the most important determinants of land value. What your property is zoned and what can be developed in your property, right? If this property were zoned R1 and you could only put a single family home here, however many millions you could sell a piece of property for single family homes opposite, Bryant Park and opposite the library, it still wouldn't be worth anywhere near as much as this property is worth as a C6, as being zoned C6. So it's one of the most important, which is why it cares. Just going back before, as we start zoning, right, cities only have the power to adopt zoning if it's been delegated. Every state has adopted it, so to some degree, every city has the power to adopt zoning, but only incorporated cities. But exactly what powers they have, just because they have the power to adopt zoning of some kind, exactly what kind of zoning they can adopt, or how they can adopt it, or what the rules are, or what they can establish, can vary, even with the same enabling legislation, because the courts interpret it differently.
So that would be the state?
The state delegates, right, through the state enabling legislation, then a city adopts a zoning ordinance based on, by having a zoning commission, having a public hearing, and then it has a zoning ordinance. But let's assume 1928, city X state X adopts the state enabling legislation. City X adopts a zoning ordinance, and city X says that the zoning ordinance says that before anybody can develop, before anybody can build a residential building on everybody has to use their residential building, can only build 6 family homes on their property. No other use is allowed on their property. You might go back and say, does the state enabling legislation allow the city to set up that rule? It probably would, actually. But there could be things that it doesn't, that a city wants to do, and there definitely are things the city might want to do that the state enabling legislation doesn't give them the power to do it. There's a constitutionality question. Let's say the city adopted a rule that said only women can live on this side of the street. You can only live on the east half of the city if you're a woman, and you can only have housing on the west side of the city if you're a man. Well, that's probably not, leaving aside the fact that it's unconstitutional because of the U.S. Constitution, discrimination on the basis of race, religion. Actually, I take it back. U.S. constitutional, you could do that. Because the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. So, you are not protected as a woman, as a man, you're not protected. So New York City, or City X, could adopt a zoning ordinance that said only men in this half of the city and only women in this half of the city. From the constitutional perspective, federal constitutional, because New York State Constitution you couldn't. Federal constitutional purpose, you can do that. But the question is, does the zoning ordinance allow you to do that? The argument would be that, does the enabling legislation, that the enabling legislation wouldn't allow New York City to adopt that kind of a zoning ordinance because it doesn't meet any of the other things that it requires. It's not for the basis of lessening fires, it's not for the basis of anything else that are the basis for the zoning, so probably couldn't do that. Okay, so, as I said, the biggest determinant, right, zoning is an important determinant of land value, and the first place you look, and that has to do with what uses are permitted. And since the concept of zoning arose originally to control uses, let's talk about uses. All right. there are, uses under zoning are in three categories. There they are: permitted, prohibited, and accessory. The vast majority of zoning ordinances list permitted uses and not prohibited uses. I don't know, right? So, just New York City zoning ordinance, if you look in the zoning ordinance and you looked for, I'm trying to think of something, and you looked for software development in the zoning ordinance, anyone know? Would you find it? No, you wouldn't. So, it is prohibited. We all know that isn't actually true. So how do you get to have software development?
Reclassified.
You classify it, you call it something else. It's office, right? That's what most of it would be. You have to find a classification that it fits within. But in most ordinances, the uses that are permitted are listed. You fit yourself in a classification, and sometimes, and we're gonna spend a little bit of time talking about this, what that means. Zoning ordinance, a couple of examples. Zoning ordinance allows hospitals. You wanna open a veterinary hospital. Is it a permitted use or not? All the zoning ordinance says is hospitals. Does anybody have any thoughts?
Yes.
Yes, why?
Just doesn't specify.
Well, it doesn't specify, but why would you say a veterinary hospital? Because it's a kind of hospital.
So it doesn't say human hospital.
Right, it's a hospital, veterinary hospital. Anyone say no?
It depends on the definition of hospital.
We don't have, it hasn't been defined, it's not defined in the ordinance. Now, what you do then is when you're looking for something in any law that's not defined in the law, you can go to like Merriam-Webster, you go to the actual dictionaries. But if you looked up hospital in a dictionary, it would cover both people and animals. It's, place for treatment of the sick and injured is probably what a hospital is defined as.
I don't see why not.
Right, because of the same thing. Okay, now let's look at it a different way. Hospitals, a veterinary hospital has a rear yard, let's not call it, has a play space. It has an outdoor play space for the animals as they're recuperating to play, or maybe if they're injured, they need a place to run around. Does that make you think differently?
Could be nuisance to neighbors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right, a people hospital is all enclosed. An animal hospital could have, and all of a sudden you have a hospital in a residential district, and now you've got barking and honking, I'm just thinking ducks, and maybe you have roosters at, sunrise at 5 a.m., or you just have animals out there. That have very different impact. So there is no answer, but you would have to be able to convince them. There are court cases both ways. Court case that says a hospital is a hospital, and court cases that say because the impacts are different, it isn't the same. Different states, different court cases. I'm just saying it can be looked at different ways.
What are zoos classified under?
Zoos. They would be generally what's called community facility or public use or public institutional use. There's a few different places have different categories. New York City, they'd be called community facilities. Other places call them might call them a public use.
Sometimes they fall into two categories.
Oh, absolutely. Things can fall into two categories, and what happens there depends on your ordinance. But when you were saying, Kyle, right? Did I get that right? Said something about because it's not defined. One of the most, if you're looking at a zoning ordinance, you always have to go to the definitional section. Because what something is defined as is critical to what you can do with it. Now, the village of Mamaroneck has a horrible zoning ordinance. I mean, it's beyond horrible. Badly written, and they keep trying to update it, but whoever writes it can't write. Anyway, so they're trying, there's an issue with fast food restaurants. Where should so they're trying to set up definitions for fast food restaurants. How do you define a fast food restaurant? Then they're trying to set up a different definition of something, what they call, like, what are called sort of fast casual. But they've created something else called casual, I don't remember what it was, casual restaurant, which has nothing to do with fast food. Like a bakery is a casual restaurant because they don't wear uniforms. So if they wear, it makes no sense. But how it's defined is critical to understanding. So you always have to check. So the same term in different cities is going to mean different things. Always check the definitions because you have to know. So a big one, and that's obviously we're going to spend a lot more time talking about, a little bit more time, has to do with hotels. What is a hotel? What is a residential use? When are they the same? When are they not the same? We're going to talk about that next week. But going back to use, I want to talk about New York City zoning doesn't allow supermarkets, or didn't at the time this started, or department stores in M1 zoning districts, okay? May now, this was 20 years ago. Zabar's is located in an M1 zoning district. How did Zabar's get to be located in an M1 zoning district?
Was it Grand Valley?
What?
You classify as a restaurant?
No, because the Zabar's on 125th Street, the big Zabar's.
They made their own food.
I'm sorry?
They made their own food on site.
Well, you have the right idea.
They opened under different use.
No, but how? The city's looking at this, is how. No, everybody wanted Zabar's to be there. The city, the community, everybody wanted them to be on 125th Street. So if you look at their certificate of occupancy, it says something like warehouse. Because a warehouse is a permitted use in an M1 district.
So they just bent the rules for them?
Essentially, that's what they did. Because it was something that everybody wanted, and if they had to wait until they rezoned it, maybe they could have anyway, this was a way to do it.
Could they just do a
It
variance?
doesn't usually happen. They probably couldn't have gotten a variance, but it would have taken a while. Maybe they couldn't have. They maybe could have gotten the city wanted it, they maybe could have changed the zoning, but for various issues, this was just, they convinced, right?
The
So-
city wanted it, right?
And the city, everybody,
That's
but
why
it's not
that's
just the
so much.
city, the community wanted it. If the community hadn't wanted it, they couldn't have done it. The community needed, there was no, that part of Harlem, there were no supermarkets, and it's not just it's a good super, it's a big, good, at the time, you all don't know this, but at the time, Zabar's was historically relatively inexpensive. It wasn't a cheap supermarket, but it was not an expensive supermarket. I don't mean Zabar's, I do mean Zabar's.
I think you're right.
Not anymore.
Yeah, it's still there, at least it was last year.
On the west side.
There was no Babka, more importantly.
I'm sorry?
There was no Babka, more importantly.
They have it. But that's how it happened, you have to fit within the use. Okay. Now, accessory uses, I'll talk a little bit more about accessory uses. But accessory uses as a simple kind of overall are, uses that are, sorry, I always have to get to there's 4 definitions of it. I can't find. I'll have to pull it out. Use that is generally found in common, generally on the same lot, whatever lot is, as, associated with, there's 2 other definition terms, and I'm forgetting, I'll remind you, I'll remember it next week. But an accessory use is a use that is not otherwise permitted or is not specifically listed, because if you can have a use and an accessory use, then you have two uses on the property, right? So my property is used for commercial and residential, because they're both allowed. Okay, that's fine. Suppose residential is not allowed. Let's say in an industrial district in New York City, you can't have residential use in an industrial district. Well, you have a big building, you wanna have a superintendent live there, right? You wanna have somebody there, it's a big building, it's a big operation, you need somebody on the premises all the time. That superintendent use could be an accessory, would be permitted as an accessory use. Right, so an accessory use can allow something that's not otherwise permitted to be there, otherwise it's just, two uses of the same thing. You have a restaurant and and maybe, the restaurant has a small dance floor. Dance floors aren't allowed in, or let's say it's a restaurant, and a place where you could have a restaurant with music, but it doesn't provide for a dance floor. So maybe you can put up a dance floor as an accessory use, right? So that's an accessory use. So an accessory use is permitted, so a permitted use is always gonna be listed. An accessory use, you have to convince if it's really accessory. Okay, that's it. So there's all this category. Sorry, there it is. Incidental to the primary use, subordinate to the primary use, customarily found in connection with, and generally located on the same lot. Those are the standards for an accessory use. Right, a little vague, what is subordinate, that's it. Okay. We'll talk about, we can talk about hotels. Oh, before you go, one clarification on the syllabus, somebody pointed out to me that there's an error on the syllabus. In the listing of, the grading thing, it talks about the midterm date as being, July 8th. But then when it's listing the readings for each class, it lists it as July 2nd. The midterm is July 8th. So that July 2nd date is wrong.